In 1933, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, with the ultimate goal of establishing German dominance in Europe and expanding Germany's influence across the globe. As Hitler gained power and built up Germany's military forces, the nations of Europe were forced to defend themselves. But what about the United States? Across the Atlantic, many Americans felt insulated from the distant war in Europe. In the aftermath of the First World War, the United States had passed the Neutrality Acts, a series of laws passed in order to prevent U.S. intervention in foreign affairs, including war. These laws reflected Americans' support for isolationism, which is when a country seeks to minimize its involvement in international affairs, instead focusing primarily on domestic concerns.
Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
If war breaks out in Europe, I think that this country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglements.
I haven't the slightest idea of European affairs.
In the event of war in Europe, I think we should stay out of it entirely.
However, an official policy of neutrality didn't mean that the United States couldn't be unofficially engaged in the war. And as you know, the United States' efforts to stay out of the conflict ultimately failed. For this lesson, you'll learn about key events in World War II from an American perspective in order to answer the unit essential question: how did participation in World War II affect the United States socially, politically, and economically? For this lesson, we will begin with an overview of America's role in the Second World War and how that role evolved over time. We'll accomplish this by analyzing examples of propaganda produced by the United States between 1939 and 1945, like excerpts from this film series, Why We Fight.
Is it because of...
Propaganda refers to information used to influence how people feel, what they believe, or how they think about an idea, issue, person, or group. Propaganda often relies on biased or misleading information. Consequently, it has a negative connotation. However, propaganda is not itself inherently bad or negative. Our lesson essential question is, what can propaganda teach us about the United States' changing role in World War II? To help us answer that question and examine different examples of propaganda, we'll use these guiding questions. How was propaganda produced and shared? Why was propaganda used in the United States during World War II? And what themes were present in propaganda during World War II? Let's get started! Initially, the United States was keen on maintaining its neutrality. Pro-isolationist groups like the America First Committee argued that the United States should focus its time, funds, and energy on domestic issues, not foreign squabbles. They claimed no foreign power realistically posed a threat to the United States. However, as the war escalated abroad, Americans' anxieties increased. There was growing interest in preparedness, strengthening the nation's defense, and readying for potential military intervention at home or abroad. The tension between preparation and remaining neutral was evident in propaganda posters produced between 1939 and early 1941. Pause here to jot down some of your first impressions of these posters in your PDF. Posters like these were hung on the walls of public spaces, including post offices, libraries, and stores. The use of bold colors like red and yellow, helped draw people's attention and evoked emotions like fear, anger, or dread. The slogans and messaging were also significant. In this example, the message on this poster is a call to action. What action? Production. Production of what? All of the tools and resources needed for war. Everything from food to bullets to planes. Increased production was a way to support America's allies through the Lend-Lease program, which allowed the United States to provide weapons, ammunition, and other supplies to its allies while still officially remaining neutral. But why was it so important to support America's allies? Because these allies were America's first line of defense against the advancing Nazis. If they failed to stop Germany's expansion, America might find itself unable to continue to remain on the sidelines. Another common theme from this period was preparation on the home front. From the creation of victory gardens, or home gardens planted to increase food production in preparation for food shortages during the war, to a campaign to fingerprint all Americans, there was a sense of urgency to prepare for war. Just in case. Pause here to respond to the guiding questions in this section in your lesson PDF. After watching the following clip, take a moment to jot down your initial reactions in your PDF.
Planned for months with brilliant cunning, favored by our lack of readiness, with the sky and sea all their own, at 7:55 a.m., hell broke loose. Man-made hell, made in Japan.
This 1943 film, entitled December 7th, is one example of government-produced propaganda. It is a dramatic recreation of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. Japan's shocking attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America directly into war. It was time to mobilize, which means to reallocate resources to meet the demands of war. These resources included anything that could be used to support the war effort. Propaganda now called on Americans to join the war effort. But supporting the war wasn't just limited to soldiers. It also included jobs that supported the production and transportation of materials, as well as individual efforts to conserve, like eliminating food waste and rationing in-demand supplies like oil and rubber. Another prominent theme was unity, or the need for the United States to come together to focus its energy on its foreign enemies. But as themes like revenge became more common, propaganda's dark side emerged. The enemy, especially Japan, was often depicted in a racially prejudiced manner, further fueling xenophobic sentiments and policies like the internment of Japanese Americans, which you'll examine later in this unit. On a brighter note, propaganda also portrayed the indomitable American spirit, soldiers as heroes, civilians as resilient supporters, and women as the backbone of industries and military auxiliaries, which you'll also see more of in a later lesson.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie.
This spirit was captured in comics and music, which blended propaganda and entertainment, like the song Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy by the Andrews Sisters.
He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B.
Government-produced radio songs and films were used to promote patriotism and garner public support for the war effort, often through fear.
German conquest of Europe and Africa would bring all their raw materials, plus their entire industrial development, under one control. Of the 2 billion people in the world, the Nazis would rule roughly 1/4, the 500 million people of Europe and Africa, forced into slavery to labor for Germany. German conquest of Russia would add the vast raw materials and the production facilities of another of the world's industrial areas. And of the world's people, another 200 million would be added to the Nazi labor pile. Japanese conquest of the Orient would pour into their factory the almost unlimited resources of that area. And of the peoples of the earth, 1,000 million would come under their rule, slaves for their industrial machine.
Celebrities in Hollywood also used their influence to further the cause of war. One example is the classic Oscar-winning film Casablanca, a romanticized story of refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe that went on to win 3 Academy Awards. Even Disney got involved, producing animated propaganda like Donald Gets Drafted, De Führer's Face, and Education for Death, The Making of a Nazi. Pause here to respond to the guiding questions for this section in your lesson PDF. As the war dragged on, the United States needed to ensure its people remained committed to the war effort. Perseverance, hope, and the preservation of the American way of life emerged as central themes. Propaganda emphasized support for the troops and the importance of sacrifice. The idea was to keep the end game in sight and continue to fuel optimism. Posters like these emphasized patriotism and the bigger issues at stake. The war wasn't simply about winning. It was about fighting for what America represented: democracy, freedom, and a brighter future. But fear was also used to drive that message home. Losing meant risking everything. Film continued to play a pivotal role. With real footage from front lines and areas liberated by the Allies, Americans could see the progress firsthand, further solidifying their resolve. Hollywood films continued to present war in a softer and more entertaining light. The musical comedy Anchors Aweigh tells the story of 2 U.S. Navy sailors, played by Frank Sinatra and Gene Kelly, who are on shore leave. In one scene, Gene Kelly dances with Jerry Mouse of Tom and Jerry fame, an early example of an animated fantasy sequence in a live-action film. Mockery of Axis leaders and presenting them as doomed to fail offered a chance to bring in some levity and humor, a break from the doom and gloom of war. Pause here to respond to the guiding questions for this section in your lesson PDF. American propaganda during the 1940s wasn't just about supporting the war and shifting public opinion. It was a mirror reflecting America's evolving hopes and fears. In doing so, it offers us a unique perspective on the war and the nation's psyche during those tumultuous times. In the lesson PDF, you'll have a chance to explore some of the methods and techniques that helped make propaganda so effective, many of which are still employed today. But until next time, keep making history.
Hey!